where will you find resilience? REdeploy.
Okay, so to get us started, oh, can we turn the house lights up a little brighter? I don't know if this is full brightness. So to get us started, I'd like to start us off with, there was a great mention in Will's presentation about we need to make resilience engineering more welcoming. I would be curious as to the panel's thoughts on some concrete things that we can all do to work on that or make that happen.
Just to preface that, I'm slightly inclined to start talking about it because I prompted it, but also, it also seems a little weird to like, hey, we need more underrepresented people here. Let's get the white guy to talk about it real fast. Can I impose upon anyone else on the stage who feels like they're part of an underrepresented group?
I have one easy one.
Please.
Stop asking algorithm questions if your job does not involve building algorithms.
Love it. So what? Exactly.
And I've used that every day of my career.
Okay, what I will say is I feel like resilience engineering at its current state is in a position where we want to say, here's the pool, come join in when you're comfortable. And it needs to be more proactive in reaching out to people who aren't as confident to step up and say, yes, that's something I can do. There's no magic to what we're doing. There's nothing inherent about anyone on the stage that allows us to speak about this. We just need to find people who are smart in their own right, have expertise they're looking to share, and encourage them in safe ways to step up and speak about this. So more specifically, how do we go about doing that? Are there code schools or resources for underrepresented groups that we can actively go out into and say, hey, we want you to be we want to encourage your input in this area. Do you have people who are interested? We need to make time to extend our privilege to talk to them and say, here's what we think we should, would be a good intro for the idea for it. Here's what we think would be good resources to start reading on. I think that's a big part of it too. Like dropping, as I was saying before, 1,000 PDFs and saying, get started is really discouraging. They're really important. There's great information, but it's just so much to go through. And also, it's, in my mind, similar to what expectations we set for underrepresented groups in our companies. When we say, you're going to do the DEI work yourself on top of your normal job, on top of all this stuff. And also, hey, also learn about resilience engineering. And like, how many jobs do we want to give folks before we say, like, your plate is full? So how do we make room in our companies to say, okay, you're doing a lot of work. Let me take some of the work off your plate so you have availability to then do side projects. Where are we giving you more than 20% time to learn this stuff? I'm talking a lot. Please step in, someone.
We're getting to the idea of sponsorship, I think.
Being willing to train people. I mean, it's a fairly new field, or at least newish. So being able to bring people in who don't know anything and train them.
I think it also has something to do with inclusion, because, and I'm going to go back to music again, you don't have to train any of those musicians to work together. They've already been training as musicians in teams to play music together. So I feel like that might be a good avenue. I'm not good at math, or I'm not really good at science. I failed on my science classes in high school or whatever. I mean, it's like, if you don't feel you're competent in this technology stuff, there are other places like resilience and being able to help people. You can, teamwork. I'm really great at teamwork. That's resilience, How help guide them into it that way.
We did have a thought from the audience.
At work a few days ago, we were having a conversation in the inclusion channel about, somebody started the conversation about like, if the best 6 people you can find to build a product is 6 white guys, should you build it? And so it turned into this long discussion, but what I ended up doing, and I think we all have an opportunity to do, was bringing in resilience as a way to explain the value of diversity. And so it's kind of reentrant, right? Like in growing this field, if we talk about diversity as part of our mission, it's reinforcing for both sides, right? In that having these diverse voices increases the resilience of the system, and we also get to talk about, enabling people to come into the tech industry or into the resilience industry, if there is one.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was getting at too. It's just like the tech industry isn't closed to just the STEM folks. Because I really like STEAM because it has the A in there with arts.
There's one more
I
comment
went
too.
to art school.
Yeah, I think fighting bias and education probably is super important. I'll give you an example. We did Bring Your Girl to Work kind of stuff at work. And we were a bunch of us, and we said, what we're going to do. We say, we teamed up with Women Who Code, and we had the whole day of teaching those girls how to code. And parents said, yeah, well, and I quote, she's not going to like it. They didn't ask the girl, and actually it was not one parent, it was quite a few of them which already had bias towards what she might or not like. And I thought it was really sad. Actually, that particular girl that was referred to, or that particular kid, ended up having the best day of her life, and actually continuing having contacts with many of the engineers at work. And I hope we'll have a brilliant career. We all have biases, right? And I think if we don't recognize those, they are the first obstacle to moving the needle forward.
One thought from the audience.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you to those of you, the speakers, who said, do you know what this term is? And if there was one person who didn't raise their hand, you explained what that term is. And that, I think, is a really great way to get inclusion and keep those folks in your departments and in tech. Because knowing those pieces of elements, those elemental pieces, can start to build your knowledge of complex systems.
I like that because I get the comment, and Will hinted at this a little bit, because I talk a lot about chaos engineering. And so I have some of my colleagues who immediately go to, oh, we're not mature enough for chaos engineering. This company needs to fix so much more before they ever think about chaos engineering. And maybe chaos engineering is that way, but I don't think resilience is. And so I don't think, to your point, I always like to say that there is no stupid question, and that the sign of a good senior engineer is actually their ability to show that they're ignorant. So that stems, and that goes down into the more junior engineers. If you're a junior engineer and you see that a senior engineer isn't afraid to ask stupid questions and looks stupid asking it, then you're not going to be afraid to do it either.
So this is one of the reasons why in my talk I focused a lot on psychological safety and about the importance of making sure that everybody feels capable and empowered to contribute to that conversation. Because if we talk just about diversity, that's just who is in the room, but not necessarily about whose voices are being heard and who is empowered to join that conversation and to drive change.
So I don't want to belabor this point, but I do have one kind of reframing of the question. I think diversity, especially from like a ecological perspective in the work that we're doing, is super important. Those of you have probably heard Will, and I heard maybe somebody else that mentioned too, that if we send them a bunch of PDFs And there's a joke, there's a reason why we keep saying that, and it has to do with, I think John Allspaw has been called PDF as a service, because a lot of times you'll ask him a question, he's like, well, here's like 8 papers on it. And it's funny, he learned that from his thesis advisor, who was also my thesis advisor. So I think I've caught that problem of sending PDFs. But so my question is, I think there is a tendency to do that. I actually liked how a lot of you, like, here's all the research, like 4 slides of the research that you can go look at. What are some things in terms of making the material actually more welcoming and accessible that you can think of that we might be able to do, other than events like this that are very high context, very rich, but also in some sense costly in terms of, you know, people have to be here and spend time, and we're grateful for that. But how can we, any thoughts on making that part easier?
Pay people to create content. If you don't have generational wealth, it's less likely to have the time and money to go to something like this, or spend your time running blogs or hosting a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I think conferences like this do show that there is a lot of similar ideas being transmitted in other industries. So much of resilience comes from people talking about, oh, you know, medicine has been talking about this for a while, aerospace has been talking about this for a while, but it comes across, if you saw the Safely Different video, right, you can talk about this and bring context and background from retail jobs, from blue-collar jobs, all of those things. And so encouraging people and showing that there's value in those personal experiences from their backgrounds can still contribute to the conversation.
Any other questions, or any questions from the audience? Oh, good, we have one. All right, I'll run over. I'm totally going to get my steps in today.
I think there's a lot of focus rightly on learning from incidents, learning from failure. You know, the Etsy debriefing guide, shout out to John Allspaw, talks about measuring learning by seeing who feels after a debrief that they've learned something, who attends debriefs if they're optional. I'm wondering if the panel has any thoughts on operationalizing those learnings. So like what to an executive, you know, they can observe coming out of the learnings that people have, like what value does that provide to businesses? And obviously it's over a long time scale, but whatever, the more of these examples we have, I suspect like the easier it might be to adopt resilience inside capitalist organizations.
So was that the question, like how can you operationalize the learnings that you have in a way that makes sense to a business?
My opinion, learn by doing. So I think workshops are great, but I love definitely game days and put yourself in the situation where I think she mentioned very well, like be led by the least experienced person. I think that's a brilliant example of
yeah, I love that. That's great.
And got me thinking how we could do this with game days. I never thought about it, so actually I learned something today, and I want to experiment with this. So I think there's definitely something there.
I mean, it's, to a lot of executives, it's a question of budget. And it comes down to that simple question. I know that's not a simple thing, but I don't know that anyone in this room has the answer. I think that's one of the jobs that we have, since we're all resilience engineers now, is we have to figure out that question. We have to figure out how do we, short of, you know, transferring, you know, the Gelflings do the dreaming together. They touch hands and they can see each other's thoughts and dreams and stuff. Short of that, I don't know.
If you want to sell learning to executives, like the time to do the learning, it's cheaper to invest in your current staff than pay for more staff. Like buying a senior engineer is way more expensive than letting your mid-level engineer learn more.
That's a really interesting one. Any other thoughts on?
Can I actually toss this over to Dr. Cook? I feel like from other industries, like we're talking about how we're convincing the software industry to buy into this. And Sometimes the purse strings for tech companies are a little looser than, say, like government organizations or military or medicine, something like that. I'm curious if from other fields, how they approach this and how they justify it up the line.
It would be very hard for me to talk about the whole tech industry. It's a very heterogeneous environment that's got lots and lots of exemplars and across a huge range. There is no, as far as I can tell, central tendency in the industry. There's lots of variability. It's partly because it's fairly young and hasn't had the opportunity to develop lots of these traditions. Much of the learning that happens in other domains is driven by professional affiliations of the people who participate in those things. So nurses, physicians, pilots, engineers in other domains have responsibilities and expectations about learning that are part of their connection to their profession rather than their connection to a company. And I think there is a there is a tendency in the tech industry to make the company organization, the company itself, much more influential in the overall scheme of things than is the case in other domains. And I think it's putting a huge burden on corporations to be the carriers of the responsibility for learning and for advancement. I think that they're ill-suited for that, and they're obviously ill-organized for that. They're not motivated by those things. The professions have in general sustained learning and advancement in those career paths, but they've done that more or less not completely independently of the companies that they work for, but certainly not completely tied to those companies. You know, I'm a physician first, and I work at Ohio State second. And my physician, my learning is not contingent at some level upon just what the company or the corporate entity of Ohio State does. So I think we should be a little cautious about who we are charging with the responsibility for advancement and learning, especially related to the development of opportunities in careers and long-term pathways. The kind of responsibility that people have for mentoring, I don't think flows from a corporate source, or it should not entirely. There's a couple, we get confused about learning in a variety of different ways. One of the ways that I think we mistake this is we think that that there is some sort of learning contained in events, that there's this encoded message which if I only simply had the right way of, you know, if I could rework the hash on however it got in there, I would be able to say what that message was. And once I had that in hand, I could just broadcast that and everybody would somehow appreciate the relevance of it. And that's clearly incorrect. People learn different things from events. They learn in different ways asynchronously. They often learn things that are completely unrelated. And there are very few events that have sort of a learning in them. I think one of the things that we see that's a pathology is organizations trying to state what the learning is from an event. That's a pathology that's present. When an organization feels that it needs to control the meaning of an incident, you can be sure that public relations people and senior managers are busy shaping that meaning, and it's a very bad idea. So the question for me becomes a slightly different one from just how do we make the learning, make them invest in learning, but how do we generate environments that are conducive to learning and generally support that and sustain that across a variety of different opportunities, and give people that kind of a rich environment in which that can happen. And to some extent, that requires giving up some control of this, which I think is the sort of central idea of, we're going to ask what the central idea of the facilitation guide is, the ETSI facilitation guide, or the central idea of what I would call the all-SPA idea, okay? That's because it's not the ETSI guide, it's the all-SPA idea. And the fundamental idea, the fundamental all-SPA idea is this: we don't control what's learned. We're not in charge of what is learned. We facilitate people to allow them to have learning experiences, but we don't control the learning. It's not our job to extract the messages. It's not our job to figure out what the meaning of this is and transmit that to everyone. Our job is to facilitate that kind of learning environment. And I think when you switch to that perspective, many things become available to you that were that wouldn't be available if you, as the single sole source of learning, had to extract the lessons and disseminate them and all the rest of that stuff, which is a ridiculous idea on the surface of it. So I think there's a reason for optimism here, and I get that optimism from the presentations that people have, which is that they are able to gain valid, important, and business and business meaningful insights from the events that they are experiencing. And one of the things that they're able to do, and I think Ryan showed this very nicely, is they're able to demonstrate by pursuing these kinds of inquiries more deeply how the interconnectedness of the system creates the environment that breeds these kinds of problems, and why it's important for us to have that insight, why it's important for us to learn about that. And so I'm pretty optimistic about what's happening, and to some extent I would almost like to suggest the opposite to what's been proposed, which is I don't, now, please. Okay, so turn the camera off. Okay, look, here's my view of management. So we often say we'd like managers to be more involved and get them engaged and have them be more supportive and all the rest of that stuff. I have tried to do that, and we would get these people coming into the operating room every once in a while, and after they'd been there for about 5 minutes, the thing I would say to them is, don't you have a meeting you have to go to? Because they're not very helpful, and they don't understand this stuff, and they don't do very much, and they inevitably screw it up. So what an alternative view is, you are the underground, you are the resistance, you are the people who are going to make this happen, not because management gives you the resources that you are clamoring for, but in spite of the fact that management exists. And so I think that would be, and if that's the case, then reformulating the problem is one of reformulating a kind of guerrilla movement, right? We're making cells, we're engaging in training people, we're making punji sticks, and we're doing all sorts of stuff like that because our goal is really to enrich this world in ways that are productive. And to some extent, partly, and I think several people have touched on this idea that very often the messages or news that comes out of this is not management friendly, right? And if you try and build a program in your company that's going to produce a string of bad, a pretty much continuous stream of bad news, you're going to find that you're not a very popular person. So don't do it. Do the opposite. Go underground. Use subterfuge, hide, spy, sneak in, break in. Do it, but do it under the radar.
We have a question from the audience.
Not a question, just a quick comment. I've been following the wildland firefighters community, and they have this organization they set up called the Lessons Learned Center. And it gets to some of what the speakers have mentioned about kind of decentralizing the learning and pushing it out to the people who are in the field. They have a thing that they call rapid lesson sharing. They set up a website, and any wildland firefighter that's involved in an incident can quickly post a short synopsis of what the incident was and what the lessons learned were. And I think that our community could learn a lot from that approach.
Cool. Any thoughts on? Yep.
My worry is that's one person's view, and while I believe sharing things like that are good, for example, if I have a close call, I want to send a PSA out to maybe affected teams or maybe engineering wide, which is good. That's a nice thing to focus on. But you're stating your opinion as fact, which might not be the whole story. I'm curious if anyone disagrees with that or has associated thoughts.
Look, most of the stuff that's valuable comes from collections of different perspectives on the same event that allows you to enrich that and build that out. And you need to have set up those circumstances. You don't have to make them, you don't have to give them high visibility, but you do have to do that stuff. Immediate debriefings, engagement, and those kinds of exchanges are very valuable. There are people who've tried to do much larger endeavors. ASRS would be a good example, the Aviation Safety Reporting System, which is an effort to try and get people to contribute that stuff. But I don't think you have to build elaborate systems. I mean, the resilience is there. It's already there. The fact that your stuff stays up for more than 30 minutes at a time tells me that there is resilience in your system. And so the question is, how are you going to, engage an engineer around that existing resilience? And that doesn't necessarily mean building a large, elaborate kind of mechanism for processing data or building spreadsheets or large tables of this or that. Sometimes it can be very routine stuff. It might be when in some of the medical worlds, particularly the paper that we wrote about the Israeli bus bombing experience, they would do debriefings immediately afterwards. It's a 5-10 minute thing with a crew that was dealing with things immediately after the event. They got together and shared those views, right? They didn't have time for anything else, and that was what they did. And it was remarkably productive. How many of you have 10-minute meetings following your major incidents in which everybody gets together and talks about what just happened? Hands? 1, 2, 3, okay. So what I would recommend is that you 3 now prepare a paper together which describes what your experience is doing that and serves as a model for the other people in the room. That would be a good way to exchange learning.
Another question from the audience.
Maybe it dovetails nicely with my 10-minute reviews, but I saw Ryan had some really beautiful graphs of post-mortem view of what happened. But what are the kinds of tools that you guys are using to have these kinds of graphical discussions, both informal, like on a whiteboard, and formal, like what you were showing?
Yeah, so those were created with draw.io. I have not done a lot of that for the incidents we've investigated at Netflix, at least not to yet. The graphical tools that are available today are not really great for doing this kind of work, so a whiteboard is almost like the best thing to use. I think Marissa Grayson's thesis has some really good diagrams in it of how you draw all the connections to really show how dynamic the environment is during the moment of the incident. I think one of the things, like indicators you could look for in terms of knowing whether or not there's a need for this kind of work, is that as people start to do it, they will build their own tools to help them out to supplement a lot of the legwork in doing this. That's about as far as I can give you any advice at this point.
Anyone else? Shaman? Oh, it's Marissa. I bet, okay. She'll have something to say about this.
Well, since you keep calling me out on that,
Yes.
Sharing a little bit of experience doing some of the process tracing, it is incredibly difficult to trace out an incident.
Mm-hmm.
Partially, so I use lots of different frames of reference when I was going through some process tracing. One of them was people. So who's talking when at what time? And when you see that over the course of the event across channels, whether you use Slack, IRC, any other types of communication ones, the chat logs help you to visualize that, because one thing that was interesting is seeing who's in each channel. And so, you get a sense of cross-channel information that you wouldn't know just by reading the logs. Because it's oftentimes the latent information, that knowledge that's in the head, that can be very pivotal in the course of an event, because once you see, okay, this person knows someone else in a different channel. Maybe they're having an offline conversation. Maybe they're bringing up something and you understand a little bit more of their background to contextualize what they're saying. But then there's also not just the basic data, but now abstracting that to another layer. And I'll go into a little more detail tomorrow about that. Don't want to spoil it too much, but sometimes having a conceptual model on top of it at a more abstract layer can help you see new insights into an incident.
I think the textual data that exists in software is kind of an advantage that we have, where a lot of the communication is through Slack or whatever, where you can collect this data and structure it in a way that you have a huge groundwork kind of for free that other industries don't get. So just like right out of the gate, without even having to talk to people, you can start to draw some of these parallels.
That may also be a drawback.
Oh, yes.
A lot of the discussion around common ground is actually around that very thing. Is, okay, well, yeah, you can use Slack to do that, but also it's your enemy because of, oh, well, I have to read 120 lines of scroll back to get context.
Any other questions? I have a question, but we'll do audience questions first. Any questions on what's been said? Yes.
Anyone have any experience convincing an executive team?
Wait, what was that again?
For resilience engineering, have you had to convince any executive teams to really engage with the process?
I had Allspot as my indirect manager at Etsy, so I lucked out.
I don't know if you heard that. He said doesn't count.
I don't think we asked.
Same. We just started doing it.
Yeah, we just started doing it.
You probably can get very senior buy-in. The question is whether or not you want it. There are events which are so powerful, incidents that are so powerful and become so disruptive in terms of the organization's ability to function that they will, high-level executives will pay attention to this in ways that are sometimes that can be productive or can be unproductive. And I think what I would suggest is having a plan in place for dealing with that when that happens. Because one of the biggest difficulties that we see is the reactive kinds of responses to major events that then can make it actually harder to get to meaningful understandings of resilience and where the resilience exists in the system. Setting that up and being prepared for that very often is a matter of doing the kind of work that Ryan and others have demonstrated, and doing it over and over enough so that as event size increases, the willingness to have that group of people look into and provide those kinds of insights, look into those events and provide the insights, is greater, right? And that can be very helpful. To build that ability before the big event occurs is actually very valuable. And to demonstrate that ability that capacity to do this kind of deep look and exchange, this moderated exchange of views about that's productive is really very valuable. In fact, I know a whole company that's involved in trying to do that. So to sidelight, but yes, you can make these investments, but recognized that if you simply wait for the event to occur without being prepared for it, very often high management's responses are not productive.
My experience is quite similar. So I go with a lot of customers that try to, for example, have chaos engineering practices or start that in their companies, and they have a blockage from the management. And the first thing what we do is actually go and talk about business resiliency, not necessarily engineering resiliency. And they speak that language very well. I often use the example of if I'm a retailer and I have a company that provides me with 80% of my goods and my competitor goes and buy this provider, what am I going to do? It's very easy for them to understand that that's a problem and then move that discussions towards engineering and that, well, you might not see that as an executive, but we have exactly the same problem in the engineering space. And especially get them understand that the business resiliency also means the people, the technology, and everything around it. And so that usually helps a lot. There are some cases where people just don't want to hear it, often related to money and stress and time, pressure. But eventually they always come back after the first outage and say, well, maybe now it's time to talk. So sometimes time does wonder.
Cool. I think we have another question from the audience.
So there was some talk today about the increasing complexity of systems, and I've been in the industry for about 25 years, and it went from like me putting a CD into a Linux box, to what we have now, the Netflix ball of death, and all of those kinds of things. And I wonder if you all think that the increasing discussions we hear about imposter syndrome are related to that increasing complexity, and if you think so, what advice you have for practitioners who might be encountering that?
I have a theory on imposter syndrome that a friend of mine just gave me that I love, is that when you're in school, there's rules for achievement, and then when you're adult, there's no rules for achievement. So all these, 12 to 20 years used to saying, all right, if I do this, that's the level I need to be at. And especially in technology where things are constantly changing, there's no, I've succeeded, I'm done. So you constantly feel like you're behind because there's nowhere for you to say I'm finished.
I think there's a certain level of, there's a buildup in tech where some people are a junior dev 6 months after they start in the industry, and then 2 years later they're a senior engineer. And I think the grabbing for titles is part of that. It's like, how do I get to the next level? Oh, I've got senior in front of my name now. I must be doing something right. And so everyone's clamoring for that. And then there's a lot of stickiness in the middle, and how do we get beyond that? Allspa has a great post on his blog on becoming a senior engineer, which I read once a year at least. The title doesn't necessarily mean you've leveled up. You've been leveling up before you got that title. But the industry encourages you to have that title because you need to apply to senior engineer roles, and you have more emphasis in the company if you have that title. And as much as we like to say titles don't really matter, people will treat you differently with a title in front of your name. Now, on top of that, I think there's also a lot of privilege behind who gets the title and who doesn't. I think there are people in the industry who get that title much more easily than others who don't, who earn it. And I'm going to just say it up straight. Straight white guys tend to get those titles before underrepresented people do. And I know I'm cycling back to previous comments, but it's true. And underrepresented groups have to do more work. Tanya Riley has an incredible talk on being glue. I highly suggest everyone watch it and then watch it again. I think the emotional labor and the technical knowledge that needs to outdo everyone else when you're in one of those underrepresented groups plays into that. That's not to say that everyone in the industry doesn't feel imposter syndrome. I just think it's not necessarily evenly distributed. And that sucks.
I think that in a space in which the underlying technological strata is changing very rapidly, to some degree, people are always uncertain about how well calibrated they are. And the world can move very quickly to bring new kinds of demands and technical requirements in areas that one is not well calibrated in. Distributed systems was not a big thing 20 years ago. It is now. So I think that there's lots and lots of reasons why people may be uncertain about how well they know the areas and how well they're prepared. And to some extent, that's going to exist in the industry for the future. We are not going to be able, no one is going to be able to hold all the information. We're going to have to do this in a collective fashion, which means we're going to have to bring our contributions to bear, and we're going to have to share that kind of information. I find the reverse of the imposter syndrome to be more threatening, which is the person who is an imposter and not suffering from the syndrome. They just don't know that they don't know. They really think they know, and they don't have a clue. And you do encounter these people from time to time, and they very quickly get shuttled off into management channels, which is usually a pretty good thing. So, but I think that there are specific things about the industry that you're in that now make this a much, much greater problem, which is that the rate of turnover of knowledge is very high. A lot of knowledge gets stale very quickly, especially because you re-architect your systems so often, so that keeping up is a real problem. That, in turn, reflects back on this learning issue, which is that you've just made an argument very much in favor of putting more and more energy and resource into building this learning opportunities world in which people can stay abreast of things and get new information and learn new things based upon the experiences that they're having in the systems that they're having. I think you've made a very eloquent point about the importance of that. And to the extent that people feel that they are uncertain, they may actually be well calibrated because they know that there's a lot of stuff that they don't know. And our collective future seems to me to be very much vested in trying to create worlds in which those people have opportunities to learn at very high rates across the entire spectrum of the systems and knowledge that are involved in these endeavors that you're undertaking.
I'm going to selfishly ask a question, then we'll see if we have one last one and wrap up. But I wanted to shift gears a little bit because to personal resilience, and I noticed something very interesting about the talks, a number of the talks today, and how a lot of people were talking about their hobbies, diving, music. I'm a private pilot, and the role that telling stories and how we do resilience when it's a hobby. And hobbies are generally something that brings us joy. I once heard a quote, there's beauty in things done well. And I'm just kind of curious, the panel's thoughts on, we seem to naturally kind of engage in these resilience activities, even our small communities of our hobby, naturally, and yet at work, we may not do that as much. What do you think the role of being with people doing something that gives you joy plays in doing this work and not making it feel like you have to carve out resilience engineering time, since we seem to do that naturally?
I think one thing that's really big when it's a hobby is that you can choose to partake at the level that suits you, and you can choose to partake with the people that suit you, right? When diving with people who have different risk tolerances is not fun at all, and so I just don't do it. I make sure that I'm seeking out groups that are like-minded. I don't have that same luxury at work. I also don't have to deal with, in my hobby, an executive team who is pushing for action items, who is pushing for an explanation or a root cause. And so the hobby allows me to engage at a level that works organically and that we as a group can choose to say, these pieces work, and so we're going to do it, and these pieces don't, so we're not going to. And when you have the oversight and the organizational structure, that breaks apart. And so you're under greater scrutiny, you have less freedom, and you lose a lot of the empowerment that you get when it's a hobby.
Real quick, who here plays or has played tabletop RPGs? Quick show of hands. All right, my people. I had a D&D campaign at Etsy for about 3 years with about 6 other engineers. Nothing specific about Etsy other than the people who work there, and we sat down after work and we just hung out for a while. And I think there's personal resilience in that we get to collaborate on problems. I was the DM, so I guess I was creating the problems. That said, people collaborating, being able to talk with one another, and they go back the next day and they know each other. And if something goes wrong, it's like, oh, that's just Jen over there. I know Jen. She wouldn't mean to cause a problem. I'm gonna understand what her context is rather than just assume blame. And so there's resilience in understanding context from where people's perspectives are to get closeness to them, and then bring that back into your organization. And it doesn't have to be you're working close to them. You can work with people outside your organization and then take that same approach to people within as well. Also, I just wanted to shout out the fact I ran a D&D campaign.
You did retros on your campaigns, didn't you?
Oh, absolutely.
You know, you sometimes in music you don't have a choice. You do have the bassist who comes into rehearsal completely smashed. Or even worse, a show. I mean, bands have broken up over no less, you know? So it's, in music, you may not have a choice, and you may need to be resilient. I mean, there's a lot of cases where, you know, the player who played into this solo and came up with this ingenious transition for what was happening in the song. Well, what no one actually realized was that that person was covering for the stupid guitarist who just broke the string. So I mean, that's why I really like the personal resilience. And one of the things is that, I mean, I personally, especially in the imposter syndrome question, I have found resilience in complex systems giving me less of an imposter syndrome. They've made me look at my health more. They've made me want to be a healthier person. And when I say they, I mean the concepts in resilience engineering. They have made me not be afraid to fly. I read parts of Drift into Failure on an Alaskan air flight. I read that chapter flying on an Alaska plane. So, I mean, it's like, it hits my personal life, and I've been surprised at how much the study of this discipline has affected my personal resilience, for sure.
Okay, we have one slot for one last question before we wrap up, and I see a hand over there. Where did it go? There it is.
Hi. We have been talking about learning. I'm curious about how do you spread knowledge from a postmortem to the teams that were not involved. When you find resilience, how do you spread that knowledge in your organizations?
I can talk a little bit about how AWS does it. We run weekly operational meetings where we have all the senior engineers come, and actually anyone can dial in as well and participate, where everyone reviews some of the latest COEs, so corrections of errors or postmortems, share the knowledge, what was learned. Sometimes also some that are active, so what's the investigation, what's going on. But like this openly, I think. And then actually any employee can just go into a tool called coe.amazon.com. It's internal, so you can't access it, unfortunately. But it's also a source of knowledge that every information is free. Now, it doesn't mean that it's easy, because actually there's thousands of those, but at least it's a start.
There's a variety of things that you can do. Probably the first order of business is to make the review meeting such an attractive magnet for people to come and participate in, that the learning is high in that setting, because that will diffuse faster than anything else that you can do. And so investments in the quality of the review meeting, making sure that it's likely to produce interesting results and new insights for people, is number one. Number two is to have a meaningful write-up of that review meeting that goes into the details and what the actual substance of things were. In a lot of institutions, organizations that we visited over the years, what we find is that the lasting trace of an event is in two places. One, a series of JIRA tickets, and the other is in the stories that a few old-timers tell about how things used to be here. I do think that, by the way, that that's an actually valuable resource to use, and I would encourage you to try and create settings in which those people can talk about these events and the past experience. We wrote a chapter some time ago called Distancing Through Differencing, where we talked about trying to recover memories about accidents in organizations so that they could inform next generations. So I think those are valuable things. So I would go number one with the facilitation of the review meeting to try and get as many people wanting to come as possible, something that ALSPA has demonstrated is possible. Number two is to create a document that comes from that, or maybe even precedes that. That's something that Nora has developed a technique for. Nora Jones was here, back there. So you could ask Nora about how she does it. But she develops a document in the process of doing the investigation of the event and preparing for the postmortem, that then becomes the sort of holder of those kinds of things. The third thing would be these oral stories, these characterizations that people are able to remember and share. And I think those actually are the ones that tend to be the most lasting, because people carry those around with them from place to place. And I would say that as you grow as you become older in the industry, your role changes from being primarily the generator of those sorts of events to being the rememberer of those sorts of events. And in the future, your job will be, as it has been since prehistoric times, to sit around the campfire and tell stories to scare the young'uns.
All right, I think that's a good note to end on. So let's give the panel a round of applause, and also, obviously, our amazing speakers for day one.